Why is Halo 2 so amazing and well regarded? I think it's carried by so much more than just pure nostalgia. It is a timeless classic that I think defied all odds, and I don't think it's an over-exaggeration to say that it literally changed the world. However, that legacy was not acquired lightly. Halo 2 had probably one of the most tough development stories out of any Halo game period, and maybe even one of the more difficult ones when compared to the larger world of video games. Halo 2, interestingly enough, was my first ever experience in the Halo franchise. When I was young, this is when I fell in love with FPS games as a whole, and Halo 2 was certainly a key factor in sparking that love and passion. In fact, some of my earliest memories with video games at all are actually from Halo 2. And you might say, well, a lot of the reverence and positive feelings towards it now that you or others may have is purely based in nostalgia, and anything from your childhood you're bound to think much more fondly about. And I disagree with that for a lot of reasons, but mostly because it's a game that I still think holds up quite well in a lot of ways, even almost 20 years later. Sure, the game released nearly 2 decades ago, and it's not going to have the same level of details that a game nowadays would have in a lot of ways. Don't get it twisted. As much as Halo 2 is an excellent game, it isn't without its flaws and compromises it had to make. In fact, the campaign of Halo 2 had to make a ton of sacrifices along the way to ensure the game still got shipped, meaning the campaign was originally going to be much different as far as the story goes, and even some of the gameplay mechanics and sequences had to be just totally cut out. Now, much of this cut content would be later reused in something like Halo 3 or ODST and some other projects, but despite Bungie not being able to do everything they wanted or even showed off in demos at E3, I still think everything from the complexly structured campaign to the multiplayer mode that made Xbox Live a household name in many ways, the ability to play online multiplayer with people who were not in the same room was pretty damn groundbreaking at the time, and much of the skeleton framework for what makes up multiplayer design and matchmaking today is heavily inspired still from Halo 2. While it's certainly not a flawless game, I was pleasantly surprised about how much I really do feel a lot holds up with Halo 2, pretty much 2 decades after its initial launch. And in hindsight, it's really no wonder why it catapulted Halo as a brand into the mainstream and would certainly help define the original Halo trilogy as some of the golden era of video games. When it comes to discussing Halo 2, nostalgia is a super important element, and even for myself, I cannot totally disassociate some of my childhood memories from at least being a part of my lens for analyzing this. For example, I never recalled the same sense of joy quite like when the physical Xbox disc of Halo 2 my friends and I had would work. We were pretty young kids at the time, around 8 or 9 years old, and you know how it is, like we weren't the most careful with our stuff. The disc had all kinds of scratches and marks on it, and the original Xbox would have a hard time reading that disc sometimes. So what we would do is we would go to the bathroom, submerge the Halo 2 disc in an empty toilet of just water, flush it so that the water would run over it, and then try the disc. Most of the time, that did the trick and allowed us to play. It was stupid, obviously, but like the amount of excitement we would have as the game booted up, we would play all night because we knew how hard it was to get it to work to begin with. But as it turns out, that story of difficulty of getting the game to work was not just for us as young kids, but Bungie themselves had an absolute nightmare developing the game to begin with. The development of Halo 2 is actually extremely well documented and transparent to a point where I feel like many games don't really capture that same sense, for better or for worse. We don't really get to see behind the curtain in the same way that we did or have done with Halo 2. Bungie had been riding the insane momentum and high from Halo Combat Evolved. This launched Microsoft and the Xbox to brand new heights, and with fans greatly anticipating Halo 2, the pressure was on to not only make a good sequel to Combat Evolved, but to blow every conception of what Halo could be out of the water. And Bungie wanted to shock fans, not merely satisfy them with a good enough product. They wanted to completely destroy whatever preconceptions they had of what Halo was. You might say this is overambitious, and maybe it made the product what it was, but that ambition would partly be the reason why Bungie was so stressed out trying to produce the game. At the time, they were still working with the tech and the engine of the original Xbox, and this meant many of the ideas and scenarios and mechanics for Halo 2 just weren't really possible, even though as hard as they tried to optimize these things, it just wasn't happening in a lot of cases. The amount of pressure and crunch that was piling on for a sequel to pretty much the most popular FPS of all time then meant that they had to walk back a lot of things that they literally revealed to the world and said was going to be in the game, but it just wasn't. For instance, Bungie showed off this demo at E3, this giant, intense, large-scale battle on Earth against the Covenant, where you're battling in this, exciting and hectic battleground, and this was fully intended to launch with the final build of the game, but obviously, if you've played Halo 2 at all in your life, this sequence and mission is nowhere to be found. We have missions that try to capture that spirit a little bit, but it's just not really the same. Bungie essentially had to make a choice. Either, keep all their cool and new ideas in the game, but at the cost of the performance and overall quality of the experience, or thin out the game to only what's necessary, and it will be a much tighter and cleaner experience, but at the cost of much of the innovative ideas that they had and wanted to implement. At the end of the day, that was the route they took, however. And personally, I'm happy Bungie handled it this way. Not only for the sake of Halo 2 itself, but because it also meant that they had more time and resources and, budget to think through a lot of these ideas and perfect them. For example, stuff like the ODST first-person drop pod sequence or Chief teaming up with Arbiter fully would be, fully fleshed out in later games. While every Halo has had a fair amount of cut content or things that just didn't pan out the way they wanted, I think Halo 2 probably suffered from this the most, but Bungie, in about the last 10 months or so before launch, really buckled down and committed to polishing the feel of the game and finding the fun given the new smaller amount of content and more realistic package they had to offer. But they actually spent a majority of their time just playtesting the game and making sure that it felt fun still, and that's a very different strategy than I feel like a lot of AAA games now take when it comes to refining the last elements of their game. But of course, we can't ignore the fact that it made a huge amount of sacrifices along the way. I personally still think that it has a very stellar offering of content, however, everything from the campaign experience to the incredible multiplayer as well. Halo 2 has probably the most complexly structured story. Like, you've got this ribbon structure where Master Chief and Arbiter play key yet opposite roles that end up converging near the end. And, a ton of like subplots and other characters. Like, there's a lot going on in this campaign. But also, aside from story, I think the level design does a lot to improve on what Combat Evolved already set in place. There's far less like monotonous backtracking compared to that game, and that's thanks to the slight upgrades in tech and even just, more fundamental game design stuff. But the balance of stuff certainly isn't perfect. I mean, the elephant in the room, the obvious example is obviously how unbelievably broken and ridiculous that the Jackal snipers are on Legendary, but when you're playing on something like normal or even heroic, they're still a challenge, but, they're doable still. Halo 2 would also show a clear jump in sophistication when it comes to mechanics, as you can dual wield different weapons this time. You can actually use an energy sword this time. It was in Combat Evolved, but the player couldn't actually wield it themselves. So again, it's stuff like that we wanted to do in Combat Evolved, but maybe couldn't for one reason or another. Halo 2 captures a lot of that stuff. It feels like a genuine innovation from the previous title in so many ways. And the approach to multiplayer Bungie had was interesting because they wanted the multiplayer mode to feel like genuinely as deep and rewarding as the campaign. I mean, obviously, that was the main selling point of Halo initially was the campaign experience, and the multiplayer was sort of an offshoot of the things that they had already developed and allowed you to play with your friends. But Halo 2 multiplayer, they actually wanted to make it feel more like its own standalone experience, which they really accomplished that primarily through the use of Xbox Live and the way that it could now be played in a more online setting. That completely changed the game. So Halo 2 had a very unique approach to both aspects here, and that's part of the thing that I feel like makes it so incredibly special. But what I want to start with is analyzing a bit of the campaign and talking about the single player. The campaign of Halo 2, like I said, is very unique. You have this dual character structure where Master Chief is receiving accolades and being praised after destroying Halo in Installation 04, and on the flip side, the Elite, who we would later know as Arbiter, is being reprimanded by his superiors for his shortcomings. But what I personally find very interesting about Halo 2's campaign, while structurally it's mostly told through the perspective of either of these two characters at any given time, it's not exactly a character story per se. se. It's actually way more thick on plot and events and motivations and side characters rather than actually, developing these two characters specifically. But it's told very effectively through these two unique perspectives, if that makes sense. We're not going to go over every single minute detail about all of the complexities and winding subplots about the characters of Halo 2 and everything, because out of the whole trilogy, this game is by far the most intricately structured, and I don't want to get too caught up in the weeds. Basically, we have a plot where Master Chief battles the Covenant from Earth and hunts down the High Prophets, whereas Arbiter is initially tasked with helping the Prophets and facilitating the Great Journey, essentially sparing Arbiter execution in exchange for completing tasks for them. And it's a complicated web of interconnected arcs between Master Chief himself and, of course, Arbiter, who you end up encountering later on, Cortana and her hidden motives, Gravemind, the Prophets and their betrayal of Arbiter, Tartarus, the lie that is the Great Journey, the Covenant Civil War that breaks out, and so on. Like, there's so much going on in this. But what's funny is that Halo CE story is like, haha, we fight space aliens. And then Halo 2 story is like, imagine that everything you've ever known betrayed by the people you thought were the closest to you and they had the best interests in mind, but they're actually to push their... And then Halo 3 story is like, haha, we fight space aliens, but together this time. Of course, it's a bit more complicated than that. I'm just pulling your chain, but, you get the idea. The game has been out nearly 20 years, and you can learn all about the story in countless YouTube videos that do a great job detailing everything about it. But I do want to talk a bit about the campaign's gameplay and a lot of the missions as well. I really do love the way the game opens up, and specifically the first mission I think is designed fairly well, and of course you cannot forget the iconic moment of Master Chief literally returning the Covenant bomb back to the ship. That's the moment that really sets the tone for the game, but to be quite honest with you, I actually don't think really the first couple of missions are anything that special. Outskirts is like basically what we wanted out of that E3 demo, I think in a lot of ways is what people are expecting, but this level just isn't really all that up to par in my opinion. It's not terrible, but it leaves a little something to be desired. It's not quite as intense or maybe frantic as it should feel of like, oh my god, the Covenant have invaded Earth, and it doesn't have that sense where it really hits home. And this is especially awkward because the mission opens up, like the cutscene is very like fast-paced and it sets this kind of tone that you're expecting when you come in. But the opening bit is like, it kind of like this little wave defense thing where it's like kind of boring in between waves. There's a lot of like downtime where you're just kind of just like walking around, you're not really sure what to do, and it completely goes against and contrasts heavily with the pace and tone that the initial setup of the mission felt. There are a lot of good moments here and there in Outskirts that I really do like and that stick with me, barring the Jackal Sniper Alley that can go to hell. But anyways, there's a few visuals and little gems in Outskirts that almost capture that feel of what that E3 demo I feel like was trying to encapsulate, but it doesn't quite get there for me. And then same thing with Metropolis. I like Metropolis a lot mechanically, but there's a few instances in that level where it feels like unbelievably stretched out. As I was playing it again, I think one of the biggest hurdles that Outskirts and Metropolis had to overcome is the fact that they don't really feel like Earth all that much, or in a way that, feels relatable to us in some sense. I think that E3 demo where they had the Covenant on Earth feels a little more relatable and homey, if you want to call it that, but I don't know, it feels like when I'm playing Outskirts and Metropolis, it's like this alternate version of Earth that, I don't know, just doesn't really quite capture the same feel that I think this level is trying to emulate. Again, I can't necessarily blame Bungie too hard for this because this is most likely the element of the game that saw the most sacrifices and cuts when it came to content and ideas, and I think this is particularly obvious when you get like near the end of Metropolis. This whole bit where you like actually board the Scarab, they would do the sequence in future Halo games, but it was done in a much more complex and intricate way where it affected the gameplay. But in Halo 2, it's pretty much just a glorified moving platform in some sense, like it's part of the level design. So while it's cool initially and visually for the time, this was beyond groundbreaking, I don't think it actually has as much of an impact these days when I replayed it. It still holds up fine, don't get me wrong, but you can tell like this is one of the areas of the game where they have the Scarab walking through Earth, and it's supposed to have all these these destructive habits and stuff like that, and it's going to play a much more dynamic role in the environment, but it just really doesn't. I like the way that it ends off at this level, and it's a very sick set piece, but beyond that, the Earth bits are not what I would call overall a high note to open Halo 2 with. Now, after this mission is actually when we would begin to play as an elite for the first time. You actually get to play as Arbiter, and what's interesting about Halo 2's campaign is you essentially have what could have been one mission split into two. So, for example, the first, like, pretty much opening two missions with Metropolis and also Outskirts, you could kind of see that being one mission maybe, right? It's very similar terrain and atmosphere, all that kind of stuff, and then you have, similarly, Arbiter and the Oracle, which, for all intents and purposes, could have been one mission, but that's kind of how the Halo 2 structure really goes. So the next two levels, you are literally playing as an elite, and I think for the first time when we all experienced this was totally unexpected and is actually key in understanding the entire complexity of the story of Halo 2, because you really get to see what's going on from Arbiter's perspective and everything going on inside the Covenant, more or less. They could have gone the route of making Arbiter's mechanics totally different to Master Chief's, but they didn't. They kept the feel of what Halo 2 is very consistent, for better or for worse. I think you could make the case that it would have been interesting to have slightly different mechanics for Arbiter, but I think leaving it the same was probably the better choice for what the package of Halo 2 is. The only real difference is the change in color in the HUD, and that's essentially it. Throughout these two levels, the tone is mostly somber, and you're primarily fighting Flood enemies. They made the choice, and people have discussed this a lot, where, you know, when you're playing as Master Chief and fighting alongside the Marines, you're typically fighting elites and Covenant. But however, when you're playing as an elite and therefore alongside the Covenant, you don't actually fight humans at all. You're only fighting Flood. There's actually no point in the game where you're just fighting actual Marines. Maybe you'll fight some ones that have been overtaken by the Flood here occasionally, or you'll see them, but you never actually get a head-on fight with actual humans at all. And that was a choice they made, for better or for worse. For the most part, though, I love almost all of Arbiter's missions. I think the level design is great in most of these, and I love using the Covenant Carbine. It's one of my favorite weapons in Halo, period. The Halo 2 Covenant Carbine kind of just hits different. After the first two opening missions with Chief and then the next two with Arbiter, we get to possibly my favorite level in all of Halo 2, which I think it does a great job at doing some very cool things with subtle storytelling, but also is the level that I like the most from a gameplay perspective. I think it does the best at utilizing everything that makes Halo 2 sandbox unique. You get some great sequences with all kinds of weapons, and you get this Scorpion bit that I actually think is probably the most fun in the game, other than maybe the one in Metropolis. Remember, these levels generally come in pairs, so Delta Halo and then its following mission, Regret, I think are some of the highlights in the game. This pretty much like sets up the first act and is also kind of feels like a finale in its own little way. Like an arc gets completed here, but then it immediately sets up like 3 or more different story arcs that the game is going to continue on. Like you get this satisfaction of having something resolved, but then it becomes even more interesting because like 3 or 4 other genuinely interesting developments in the story get added, so you want to keep playing and continuing. It doesn't feel like a chore or like you're being strung along. It's a very natural progression, and I do think Bungie did a great job here of actually optimizing what's important about the story, even though I know they had to make sacrifices and maybe rewrite a few things, do some different voice lines, etc. I still think it's a good experience up to this point. What's interesting about Delta Halo and Regret is you're kind of leading up to a certain point in the game where you actually no longer fight elites. There's a moment in the game where you've fought your last elite and you actually never do it for the rest of the Halo series, or at least the trilogy, that is. This mission is one of the last few moments where you have some really well thought out battles with Covenant, and this is where I do think Halo 2 shines the most. I like fighting brutes and everything, and I actually do quite like the way they play in Halo 2 specifically. They have a distinctly different behavior and combat attack patterns than something like the Covenant or when you're fighting elites, and for some reason, as Halo would go on, they tried to make the brutes' behavior be a little bit more like elites or just Covenant in general, and I kind of understand the purpose of that, but I don't know if I necessarily agree with making that change. It's definitely a style, and I think a lot of it comes down to taste, so if you prefer the Halo 2 brutes, then obviously this is the sweet spot for you to play it in, and you get some really good brute battles up until, you know, leading to the last mission in Halo 2. However, after Delta Halo and Regret, we have stuff like Sacred Icon up to like Quarantine Zone. Admittedly, these levels I don't like quite as much. I I understand there's a lot of story material that they had to get through during these, but I can't help but feel that this area of the game in particular really got the short end of the stick when it comes to optimization, ideas, and even just execution. This is where the game feels the most stretched, where it doesn't feel that really tight and optimized experience, which I assume this is where they made a ton of sacrifices. However, this is all leading up to the moment where everything converges, where Sergeant Johnson and Miranda Keyes are trying to secure the icon. Arbiter shows up and actually takes it from them, only for Tartarus to go and secure it himself, and betraying Arbiter and explaining to him that the prophets actually set this up, that they were going to betray Arbiter to begin with, and now they have put the brutes in power rather than the elites. This completely shocks and destroys Arbiter's perspective and his entire world and everything that he's lived his life for, essentially his entire religion, and this completely changes the dynamic of Halo 2. As explained by Gravemind later on, the great journey that the prophets are attempting to execute is a lie, and it'll result in wiping out all sentient life in the galaxy. And so Master Chief and Arbiter then have to go on their own separate tasks, from activating Halo, going on the great journey, and destroying all this life. And then we get to the point in the game where it really goes off the rails, and we get to the Great Schism, where after this entire betrayal, for the first time ever, we see Covenant fighting other Covenant. And like Gravemind, besides Delta Halo and also Regret, this is probably one of my favorite missions in the game from just a pure gameplay perspective, and also a thematic and story narrative as well. Just like Delta Halo, I think it does an excellent job at utilizing Halo 2's sandbox very creatively. You have these moments where you can rescue Marines out of the actual Covenant prisons, and then you also have these bits where like you can choose whether or not to engage with certain battles because the Covenant are just relentlessly tearing each other apart. It's this very different dynamic of like, you know, you would typically just come through and wipe everything, but now you can maybe slip by, you can be a bit more passive and just watch how things play out, or wait for them to, you know, thin out the crowd. Like there's a lot more going on here than just a typical point and shoot Halo level. This mission isn't perfect, and there is a little bit of like copy paste moments, and you know, even throughout the rest of the campaign, there are some individual circumstances occasionally where it does, you know, get a little bit monotonous with backtracking, or you feel like you've seen the same hallway dozens of times, and they're not perfect about it in Halo 2, but compared to Combat Evolved specifically, it does show a lot of sophistication in maybe either them covering it up or making that backtracking feel distinctly different than Combat Evolved did. This all culminates in the final act of the game, where basically you end up killing the prophets and preventing the great journey, and Arbiter essentially, you know, rejects the Covenant and teams up with the very humans that he was dead set on destroying not too long ago, and they basically are now rising up against the Flood. And for the final shot of the game, as if Halo 2 didn't already have enough twists and turns in the story to begin with, we see Cortana answering to Gravemind, and that is where the game ends. This is why I think that Halo 2 in particular really stuck with people, because I think it covers all of its bases really well. You have this, again, very intricate and complicated story structure underneath the hood, but it's actually conveyed in the game in a pretty straightforward and easy to understand kind of way. It doesn't overload you with too much, you know, side information and stuff you don't need to know, but it's always there if you want to, you know, look under the hood and dig into that, and that enhances your experience of playing it in game. The way that it's layered on top of each other is actually so well done, and again, this is why I think from a story perspective, Halo 2 is my favorite in the trilogy. When it comes to gameplay, it's a pretty excellent experience for the most part, barring a couple of really weird balance choices, you know, particularly the Jackal snipers, and some level design I'm not in love with, and also having that like dual mission structure where basically two could have been one. In some cases that works, and in some cases I think that actually detracts from the overall experience. Also, I do have to mention that I prefer the anniversary graphics in Halo 2 specifically compared to at least what they did in Combat Evolved. In Halo 1, I couldn't help but feel that a lot of these stylistic design choices really took away from what the tone of that level was in a lot of cases, especially when it came to stuff like the Flood and their introduction. I think that the remastered graphics really went at odds with what the original vision of that level was, but I feel like that's less the case in Halo 2. I just love how big of a jump in sophistication Halo 2 was progress from its predecessor. Again, I do feel like in many ways, this was the era of games that made giant leaps in innovation in every sense of the word. Either that be technical, like the game just looks better, or they do a better job at more sophisticated storytelling, and the gameplay gets more advanced, and so on. Like, I think Halo 2 is just a giant step from Combat Evolved, even though that game does a lot of stuff I really love as well. It's clear to see where they actually leveled up as a studio and as a vision. And there's no way I could have put it into words at the time, but a lot of these choices are why that myself and many others fell in love with this game when it came out. You know, I was definitely a young kid, and there's no way I could have expressed why I love this game the way I did, but even replaying it as I'm much older, I can see clearly that it still holds up, and a lot of these just like fundamental core design choices and mechanics are the reason why this game stuck with everybody. However, as mentioned earlier, with Halo 2's vision, it wasn't just the campaign that they really wanted to nail and shock their entire fan base with. They wanted to make the multiplayer experience, which in some sense was a little bit of an add-on or a bonus or just like this little addition to help Combat Evolved feel like a little bit more of a varied experience. They really wanted to take that and fully flesh it out into its own mode. And my God, would they do that. Xbox Live and the ability to play Halo 2 multiplayer online, this was the game that really set it off. If Halo 2's campaign really nailed the single-player couch co-op experience, it completely solidified that as the quintessential way to play Halo and enjoy it with your friends, then Xbox Live would be the revolution for the competitive side of the game that would entirely change the world. Not only did Halo 2 refine so many like mechanics and balancing factors from the multiplayer in Combat Evolved, but they really started exploring many of the social features and community-driven things that eventually made Halo a household name. I mean, to me at least, Halo was always the most social-friendly video game I felt like I could play in the FPS world during that era, and Halo 2 and 3 in particular get that the most right for me. In fact, the campaign wasn't the only thing that saw a lot of its content get slashed. Halo 2 was actually originally supposed to have Forge mode, but however, this was not going to be viable for the final build of the game, obviously, and especially given the tech and the constraints of the OG Xbox, that just wasn't happening. But nonetheless, Bungie was dedicated to making a killer competitive and cooperative multiplayer game. We already mentioned how Halo in particular was one of the few FPSs at the time to really nail feeling good to play on controller, and that combined with the increased adoption of consoles and the success of the original Xbox, you know, being more implemented commonly into households, it made this absolutely incredible and accessible video game experience that anybody could pick up and play. It was the birth of the what I'm going to call like living room gameplay experience. Some of you will remember, like before Halo 1 and 2, most FPS gaming was typically done at a desktop, you know, sitting by yourself. It wasn't really set up or friendly for having multiple people playing in the same room, and Halo was the one to actually bring that to the widest possible audience and make it the most accessible. While Combat Evolved was mostly responsible for like the in the same room multiplayer gameplay, Halo 2 and the launch of Xbox Live took this to a whole new level. Now you were able to connect with others that you've never met before. To play Halo CE, I mean, at least initially, it was usually people you knew or maybe like some kind of small, more personal tournament, but with online play now possible, this opened the door for communities to form, esports and MLG tournaments, and content began to really find its way onto the internet as well as this technology became available. In fact, the way general matchmaking and friends list and UI and modern games work, everything from like the progression systems to the actual interfaces and just the basic building blocks of all of that structure came straight from the devs who designed it originally in Halo 2. Whether you've ever played Halo 2 or not personally, if you've played any online first-person shooter ever, it's been influenced in one way or another by this game. But in this particular title, we would see a lot of interesting changes to the multiplayer balance compared to Combat Evolved. There is obviously no AR in this game. You start with either SMG or a BR or something like that, but that combined with the fact that the Magnum is no longer the best gun in the game, the Halo 2 Magnum is probably like, it's a fairly mid weapon, but it's not the absolute monster and machine that it was in Combat Evolved that just completely dominated the weapon selection. The sandbox is a lot more fair, it's a lot more balanced, and even when it comes to map design, you can tell a lot more forethought went into making these maps significantly more symmetrical, because Combat Evolved has some of that symmetry involved, but it clearly, like, there are a few instances in which being on a certain team or being on a certain side is just far and away more advantageous, and it's just a better position to be in. The map design tended to be lopsided, and that is way less the case in Halo 2. They're a lot more well-rounded as a whole. You also have some neat additions to the weapon sandbox, like the brute shot, and being able to use the energy sword in multiplayer was absolutely phenomenal. I've always been a huge fan of Halo 2's aesthetic, and this is reflected most clearly in the maps. Everything from the actual art direction to the color palette they use, etc. Like, it's just such a distinct and unforgettable experience, I think is probably the best way to put it. While Halo 2's multiplayer, it's not perfect. There are a few things here and there that are kind of jank and also would be refined in further Halo games, but just the fact that they took this much of an advancement from their previous game showed just how competent Bungie was in this era and confident in their direction of the product. And I really think for a lot of us, this is why we fell in love with the game. We could feel that confidence radiating through the entire experience, you know, despite the fact that, again, they had to make huge sacrifices for the whole game, multiplayer and campaign included. Bungie worked insane overtime to make sure that the game still got shipped and was still fun and quality, and I have to give them a lot of respect for that. Halo 2 would have certainly not been the experience without that kind of dedication. But now we come full circle to our question from the beginning of the video. What really made Halo 2 so special? In my opinion, the real secret behind Halo 2's success was a combination of a few things. Number one, being in the right place at the right time, riding the massive momentum of console adoption and households and so on. Number two, Bungie's passion and skill in making a project come together in less than a year and still making something this well built and, more importantly, fun and memorable and enjoyable. And number three, the revolution of online play made bridging the social gap and sharing experiences and stories and passions with other like-minded gamers made Halo 2 a true bonding experience for people. This trifecta of factors was the perfect storm behind the meteoric success of Halo 2, and the world would be blown away once again, and all boundaries would be broken using that same momentum leading up to the final game in Halo's original trilogy.